that SAI label on it, that's a hint that the curriculum has been modified in some way. And because it's modified, it's not meeting that same rigor that the A through G standards would have. And so what we really need to do, in my opinion, is we should be doing more of the push-in where kids are, able to attend a general education class setting, and we're pushing in as special educators and helping that general education teacher to accommodate the students and help to access the curriculum with accommodations rather than modifying everything. Because unfortunately, what I have seen in my career, and like I said, I was a teacher before, is that there's a really big difference in some SAI classes versus others. Like I know in my class when I was teaching, like my kids were learning, we're going through the curriculum, et cetera. But I know in other classes, it was very unfortunate. Like there were kids that were just literally doing packets, worksheets, teachers reading a newspaper. Right. So there's such variance that it's unfortunate when kids miss that opportunity. So I say, let's do more pushing anyway, Right.
I'm more of a, with the all-inclusive push. Like, I started working in special ed in the 90s. I want to say 96, 97. Mm-hmm. And that was a real big push then for just getting all Black and brown kids in the ED classes, right? So it was the STC class and that level of segregation. And the school that I worked at had their whole section of where the special ed students were in a segregated part of the school. So I didn't like that too much. Yeah. And so my goal was at the very initial IEP in 6th grade, I would tell the parent, okay, by the time your kid is in the 8th grade, he won't be in my class but once a day. So the goal is to get them out and get them that, build of, trying to incorporate them into what we consider the general ed population, because they don't need to be segregated. There's a certain stigma that comes with that. And that stigma brings down self-esteem and things of that nature. So I think it's important. But why do you think schools, teachers, or administrators don't really promote equitable service via IEP or just in general?
Well, it's like there's a bigger problem that we have in education, particularly, in California is where I see it. I don't know how other states are, but I would say it's an American problem. We do teaching by age, right? So, you're a kindergartner, you start school at this age. And, we kind of keep kids grouped in that age and grade, sort of, I don't know what you call it, but like that's our criteria, right?
Right.
But kids, we know they have different levels. And so you can take a 5th grade class and you're going to have some kids that are reading at the 1st grade level, some kids that are reading at the high school level, and some kids all in between that, right? And so one thing that I think we should do in education is, first of all, take these kids and group them differently by ability, right? We got to get rid of that whole notion of like, well, you're just going to keep moving. Because what happens is those kids that are reading at the 1st grade level, they lose instruction the whole time because they're not, it's right over their head. So they're losing everything, all of their time, all of their engagement, all of the access to the curriculum. So there's that issue. And I think that schools, we're just so used to this model. We have to really think outside of the box. In education, we're so engaged and tied into what has come before. And so many people are just so afraid to shake things up and change. But I think if we do that, we would see a lot of gains. Secondly, a lot of our teaching programs, and again, I told you I'm a professor too. And so I remember when I was a student in my master's program, some of the things I learned, and there was not a huge emphasis on using scientific methods to teach, right? And so a lot of our teaching is not really based on a scientific sort of approach, but you can take a scientific sort of approach, which if you use applied behavior analysis, ABA, you can actually use these techniques called precision teaching and direct instruction, which really break down the skills to minute little pieces, like reading, for example, just break it down, break all the skills down to little pieces, teach the kids those pieces very fluently, and then now they can read. Right. You can do that with math, with reasoning, etc. But we don't teach that way, right? We teachers don't teach that way, and they're not taught to teach that way, to be fair to them. But we're losing a lot of kids. This is crazy. And I'm sure you saw it when you were in classrooms. You get kids who are in these classrooms where they're having SAI all day, specialized academic instruction all day. And you're talking with them and you're like, you're an intelligent kid. You're really smart. You got a lot to offer. Why are you reading at the 1st grade level? Well, the truth is that they never got the gap filled in. So
Right.
they just stayed stagnant at that level because no one ever went back, remediated those skills. And you could see it when they're reading or when they're doing math. There's like gaps, big gaps. So I think in education, we're afraid to have that conversation, but I don't know why we don't do it, because you know what, monetarily, we can allocate funds toward that. We can
Right.
teach teachers in a different way. We just need to think outside the box. And a couple resources for people if they want to learn more about that: look up fit learning, FIT learning. That's where my son started going. And I'll tell you this, and you might want to do a podcast with the person here in Claremont who runs that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, she is amazing. She took Augie from reading below the kindergarten level to he can read at the fourth grade level now in about a year,
Wow.
with using these techniques. And he has dyslexia, and it was a hard time for him to learn how to read. And he made amazing gains. And the person who created Fit Learning is a BCBA doctorate level. So you call it a BCBA D, so Board Certified Behavioral Analyst D. And her name is Dr. Kimberly Nix Barron. She's got a book. I like her a lot. I think her book may be a little bit hard for educators to swallow because it's very direct. I think that we could be a little more kind in sending that message and partnership rather than more like direct. Her book is very direct. I like it. I don't mind it, but I think people might get turned off sometimes. But just get through that and see the message, which is direct instruction, precision teaching. Let's rethink the way that we're approaching education.
Right. I agree wholeheartedly, because I feel like this post World War II model of education that we're still stuck in, right? Having kids sit in rows and you have to learn these classes to get these jobs, right? And so those jobs back then, after the post World War II, were all for like factory and refinery jobs, right? Well, these kids won't be working at refineries or factories anymore because that's not a thing. So
Absolutely.
how are we getting them ready specifically? I know, dealing with some of the high school students, I got 12th graders that are terrified to graduate because they have no idea what they're going to do after graduation, right? And so that means we didn't, as a system, didn't prepare this kid for adulthood, right? Which is what
Absolutely.
this should be about, right? And be more specific to the learning needs of every student, not just the kids with, that receive services, of course, them too, but every student kind of suffers in this transition of education where we're at, because it's so antiquated and it's so outdated. So I'm glad you said that. And I'll definitely look up that book and try to, order it. So let me ask you this. Why is it in general ed, teachers have a specific credential that kind of matches their degree, right? So you got biology teachers that majored in biology, whereas special ed teachers, they kind of teach multi-subjects, and they may be, an English major, but they got to teach all subjects. Why is that a thing in special ed?
I don't know. And let me tell you a little quick story. This is really crazy. When I was a teacher, I taught in these programs. People may have heard of them before in the high desert. They're pretty popular, like the Success Program, or AIM is what it's called now. And basically, it's like in lieu of expulsion or in lieu of getting moved to a more restricted environment, you can, move kids through the IEP process to this behavior class located on the comprehensive campus. So I was a teacher for that program for several years. And what happened with me is the district told me, hey, if you pass the CSET and you pass it in multiple subjects, you'll be able to teach all your core classes with your kids. So I did that, no problem, passed it. And then I got an updated set of information where, the district said, oh, sorry, we made a mistake. This whole No Child Left Behind, this was way back in the days. And so they said, you got to get your CSET pass in every single subject you teach, which there's no way. There's no way I was ever going to pass a math CSET. That is really hard. Like that, you have to be a math major, a science CSET, a PE CSET. And these CSETs are 3 subtests each. So they're not a joke.
Right.
Like they're really hard. And so I never did it because I was moving on to school psychology, and I just kind of had to like feign like I was doing it. Like, okay, yeah, I'll do it. And then I moved on. And now what happened with me with student loan forgiveness, there's a provision. So a lot of people don't know this either, but there's teacher loan forgiveness. And if you work in a low income or in a special education setting, you can get, I think it's up to $17,000 of loan forgiveness. This is separate than PSLF. It's totally separate. There's a little paperwork you can do, but you have to work in one of those schools and you got to be highly qualified. Well, my district from back in the days will not sign my paper to say I was highly qualified because I never passed a CSET in all those subjects. Essentially, what they're doing is punishing special education teachers who got, ability to teach in these multiple subjects by saying, hey, you have to be qualified in every subject. And that's not even the case anymore. It's changed over time. But to get back to your question, I don't know why that happens. And it's unfortunate because I will say I was no expert in any of those one areas. I just kind of threw things together. But
Right.
I think that to me, that kind of speaks to, not to be pessimistic, but like the lack of respect, right? Like the lack of really holding these students in the same regard as all other students.
Right.
Why should they get a subpar, teacher who doesn't have a thorough knowledge of the subject matter? And you see that in the classrooms. Like I said, when I was teaching, I would see that. And it's a very big difference between the teacher that teaches general education English and the teacher who's teaching special education English, who's given them packets. That's not
Right.
apples to apples, and that's not okay. Which again, right, takes us back to, what? Get rid of those SAI classes and take these kids to general ed
Right.
as much as possible.
Exactly. And then, bring in the RSP or the teacher support. So
Yes.
you have somebody as an expert in special education and how to deal with behaviors and deal with, different diagnoses. And then you have an expert on the actual subject itself. Right.
Yes, absolutely.
That would be appropriating funds in the correct way, in my opinion. So,
Yep.
so how far you think are we from ridding education of the phrase or the term special education? Like usually in my district, we say students that receive services or students who receive services. It's because it's such a negative connotation to say special education nowadays. How far are we from that?
I don't know, because I'll tell you this. When I was teaching, RSP, SDC, those are still used. And now technically they're not supposed to be used. People still say them, but like it's all SAI. So that's only in the span of from beginning of teaching. And that change came maybe, probably like at least I would say 8 years ago, where the technicality changed, or maybe 10 years ago. So within 8 years of getting into teaching, we went from not using those or using those words to not using them. So I wouldn't be surprised, especially with the way that our culture is moving, where we're calling things out a little more, that we don't get rid of that term, in the next few years and say something different. You're right. Like, more something that has not that negative connotation. Right.
Right.
I know like some people on Facebook don't like SPED. Like I know that like people will say SPED, and there's a lot of psychologists in my Facebook groups that don't like that. I have said SPED. I never thought it was offensive, but they say it's a lot of kids use it to like make fun of each other.
Right. Yeah. It's always been even in the 90s, it was kind of like what this is, those kids. Right. And so what I try to tell parents and even students that, special education is not a destination, it's a service.
That's right.
Right. So we can move to you. You don't have to go to it. You know what I'm saying? We can bring it to you. So yeah, we can bring it in the general ed classroom because it's a service, right? It's really just a service, and trying to get kids to understand that the benefits of being a student who receives services is major. You got workability, you got a lot of different, things that will carry over that will help students succeed. And they can still do that in a gen ed setting, but for some reason even schools as a system, they want to send kids to special education as opposed to give kids the services that come with special education. So do you think the assessments, as a psychologist, you think the assessments are culturally viable?
So it depends, right? Like I think what I would say about those assessments in my experience is that, like we have Larry P. You heard of Larry P. before?
Mm-hmm.
So Larry P., the ruling, and so everybody thinks it's like a law, but it's not really a law. It's like a case law. And so Larry P. basically says there was a little boy and he was put into these EMR classes. It was called educably mentally retarded. I say that word because that's what it was called, not because I'm using it as a slur. But that EMR class, he was put there, and it was because he couldn't read. It wasn't because of his cognitive ability. And so, the tests that he was given were said to be culturally biased for him, particularly on the verbal portion. So he came out lower than he really was cognitively. And then academically, he couldn't read. So they popped him in that class, and it was very segregating. And so that's where this ruling came from. For our African-American kids in California, we can't give these intelligence or cognitive tests or anything that purports to measure that. Now, the thing about that is that I think that was a good thing. I think it was absolutely necessary, especially at that time, because it seems that, in that time that Larry P. was going through school, there was just a lot of prejudice, segregation, et cetera. As we move forward, what I see, like at least with Latino, Black people, we're coming up I just see it like in California, like we're changing, right? The demographic is changing. So our kids are having access like we didn't have, right?
Right.
So like now, like for example, like if my son wants to become a graphic artist, I probably have a few friends I could reach out to and connect him with, right?
Right.
Whereas like my parents couldn't do that for me in that way.
Right.
And so the whole point of that to say is like, so now our kids have more access. So I think a lot of these tests, yeah, they're biased, but you know who they tend to be biased against really is the kids